Welcome, everyone. So, Gurdon Batra and I are hosting Indy Johar today. And I thought I'd start with a very short quote from Brian Eno, which is discard an axiom. I think that makes a great way to sort of set the stage for Indy. He's the director of Dark Matter Laboratories, an architect by training and a maker by practice. He describes himself as an explorer and practitioner in the means of systems change and dark matter design for civic infrastructure, finance, outcomes, and governance. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about his theme today, which is beyond governance. Go ahead, Indy. We'll turn over the screen to you and let you share your slides.
I just want to jump in really quick to say that we'll have a Q&A after the presentation. So please collect your questions. You can send them in chat. And between Gurdon, Ann, and I, we will facilitate the Q&A. So get your questions into the chat and we'll go through them after Indy's presentation. But yeah, thank you so much. And Indy,
put a question mark before the question shows a question.
Exactly. Indy, all you.
Thank you so much. Hi, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I'm not going to do a major presentation. I'm going to talk quite a bit about what I'm worrying about and what I'm thinking about, and hopefully that will enable us to have a conversation, and also look at why I think this conversation that we're starting to have is really critical. And I want to start by sort of framing how I am looking into the world and why and what that's started to set up for me. So step one, I think I'm looking into a world which is likely to be facing a 3-degree future at a minimum. And a 3-degree future means that you are looking at a world which is effectively at 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, almost certainly going to lose one of the major food baskets in the world. The UK has been asked by its Climate Change Committee to look at a 2-degree future by 2050, just to give you numbers. Formally, the government has been advised to look at a 2-degree future by 2050. When you start to look at these sorts of futures, what you start to see is a world which is becoming hyper-volatile and degeneratively volatile. Degeneratively volatile in its foundational capabilities. So, for example, the UK and Northern Europe is likely to lose the AMOC current. One of the major gyroscopes that effectively drives that current is already starting to fail. And if that happens, you're looking at the UK becoming significantly not only warmer, but also significantly colder, but also losing the hydrological cycle to which its agriculture depends on. So what we're starting to see is a situation that you look into the world of a world which is not only degeneratively volatile, but combined with that, a world which is also becoming thereby more vulnerable, not able to operate in predictable, but also weaponized in its vulnerabilities. So what we're seeing is those vulnerabilities are being weaponized by third parties into effectively creating new forms of fragilities of the system. Now, the kind of core hypothesis I want to also bring into this table is that as the world becomes more volatile, what we're seeing is effectively risk being externalized and pooled to states. So either corporations are not willing to basically hold the risk, so crystallize the risk on their balance sheets, and increasingly, I would argue that actually, even if you were to crystallize the risk on the balance sheets of corporates, that much of our economic corporate infrastructure is non-viable when you do that. So the incentive right now is to socialize and externalize that risk as quickly as possible from the corporate landscape into a shared pooled sort of state landscape. The implication of that is that states, as risk is now starting to and volatility is increasing, are basically effectively turning more authoritarian as a means to preserve control in a system which is becoming more volatile. So I would firstly argue that we're going to see the acceleration of authoritarian states and control-oriented states as the system becomes more volatile. And this is a system-level function, and not a function of just electoral bodies randomly picking authoritarian leaders. I think it's a function of volatility, and it's a system-level response. This has a major implication, which is for many progressives, the state has been the countervailing force to the kind of corporate market surveillance theory, but increasingly the state is going to become a source of tyranny in its own right, in its relationship with through a control lens, as it seeks to preserve control on volatile situations. Now, I'm saying all this because I think this opens up at least one very powerful framework of problem space, which is, what does that mean for our digital infrastructure if neither states, so public registries, state registries, all these things are now tools of weaponization. And I'd like to remind us all that the Netherlands in World War II was one of the most quote unquote efficient in killing people because it actually had census data. So it was more efficient than any other parts of the Nazi regime because it actually had all those registries and all those census data and was able to do this. So as states become more authoritarian and the data infrastructure is either public, actually they become more and more actually states of, and we're seeing this already around parts of the world in different formats. So that opens up one very powerful question for me, which I think needs to be on the table of what is the role of civil society systemically in this new configuration of states which are becoming authoritarian and markets which are becoming systemically corrupt as a means to be viable. And the role of civil society here is no longer what I would argue is adjunct fixing of marginal state issues, or holding corporates, building social enterprises at the edges of corporate economies. I think civil society is going to have to become a force of power in itself in really radical ways. And I think that, and is going to have to become a countervailing force to both state and market in different formats. And how we construct that power through a civil society framework, rather than just being an adjunct to fixing state and market, I think is a really important, significant question. And I think it requires us to not only protest in the streets, but also build new theories of power. What are new forms of civic litigation funds? What are dark pool capital structures from civil society that are able to go after and litigate and hold people to account in different formats? What are the other tools that are going to be necessary as a countervailing force to the systemic sort of failures that we're going to see in our institutional frameworks? It also requires us to start to imagine what is an anti-fragile state and how do we start to build a new thesis, and whether we use those words or others, how do you build state structures and how do you transition state structures to be able to operate in greater volatility and degenerative volatility, and what would that look like? And I think those domains of questions become really critical. Third, it also asks us to actually really think about public digital infrastructure is not necessarily state digital infrastructure. So I think one of the key strategies I think we should be advising pretty much any government that we can is to separate out its digital infrastructure and to make it actually independent of state and give it a different economy in order to be able to preserve, like we do with the judiciary and other frameworks, to preserve digital infrastructure as independent of state and not allow for collusion of those effects as authoritarian systems start to take power. So what is the kind of advice? And then there's more fundamental questions about what is an anti-fragile state, which includes questions like new theories of central banking, new sort of federated central bank models, new forms of monetary liquidity, and all sorts of things that are required for anti-fragile systems to be able to kind of move beyond central banking models to be able to build that resilience. I think that sets out one dimension of the scene. The next dimension of the scene that I want to lay out is that I think what we're also going to be operating in is, and this is a combinatorial problem, is we're going to be operating in what I would argue is a security economics paradigm. So I think in that volatility and in that theory of control, states are going to increasingly operate through a theory of how do you preserve stability of foundational economies, energy, food, or / nutrition, biomaterial base, all the way through to water systems, all the way through to cognitive security. And I think cognitive security is going to be one of the big issues of how can a place or a system be able to not only sense itself, compute for itself, and self-perceive itself. And cognitive hijacking of places, which has already happened through social media and other frameworks, is going to be a systemic threat to civilizations and their perspective to be able to hold a way forward, hold a way of perceiving themselves and be able to make decisions with regards to the risks that they face. And if you want to undermine a civilization or a society, you would stop its capacity to be able to perceive itself and perceive the risks and threats and be able to actively galvanize towards it. So how do we build this capacity, this cognitive capacity of society to be able to do that? I think is going to be a fundamental security economics domain. Next aspect of the security economics domain that I think is really vital is to expand the theory of security as no longer about the bounded theory of security. So the UK, for example, is not secure by putting a boundary around the UK. The UK has to be perceived as a knot of flows, whether it's actually AMOC current or whether it is actually nutrition cycle and reliant on the nutrition sort of soils of South Africa or Kenya. You have to see the UK as a knot of flows. And how does it make these knots of flows important, sort of sustainable and have continuity becomes an interest for the UK. And the open question is, does this do this by force? And I think this is not possible for lots of good reasons. So it has to talk about actually power with, and I think this systems idea of security with power with and mutual pathways is going to be really important because we're living in an age of large amounts of middle powers. So between the poles of America and China, there are vast amounts of middle powers, which if you put them together, the top 20 together, they've got 48 trillion in GDP. So within even modern day economic frames, they become very powerful forces in shaping the landscapes. The middle powers become really critical into that future. Simultaneously, what's really important is to be able to see the middle powers in recognition of their vulnerabilities. All these powers are vulnerable systemically to an entangled idea of risk. So the UK, for example, if we lose the Thwaites ice shelf in the Antarctic, well, the UK is pretty much underwater, whether it's 65 centimeters to nearly 70 meters of water underwater, depending on how many of the ice shelves we lose. So what you have is 3 dimensions of security. Yes, what can you do bounded in that context? What can you do networked? And then what do you have to do non-divisibly, as in the Antarctic or the Amazon and critical theories? So one of the things that we're starting to see is the kind of move towards a security economics frame as a means to do that. And how do we do that security economics frame? If you go back to my previous point, without this becoming a new theory of control, I think will be the real eye of the needle that we're going to have to go through, which is actually to be able to construct the anti-fragile mechanisms of state, to recognize state as a kind of systems level problem rather than a divisible problem, and operate that way. Now, to go back to the kind of the primary point that I also wanted to get into was that I think one of the big philosophical questions that we're facing is governance has been a theory of setting the norms and the rules in separation from the doing, and the separation of where the perceived harm is, where the perceived that you could preconceive where harm would be and thereby pre-govern what that could look like. And I think one of the big challenges that we face in a complex system, which is highly adaptive and highly evolutionary and emergent, is that our ability to govern systematically, as in to govern in advance, and I think there's loads of things going on about this, governance in advance of the event is fundamentally broken. And our theory of governance is fundamentally broken because actually increasingly we cannot perceive the harms that are non-visible to us. And that does open up a very important question about what does governance look like, or organizing for zero externalities or generative behaviors as opposed to externalization and extractionism. look like in the 21st century. And I think that's a paradigm of a different theory of organizing and a different theory of being an agent in the system. At a philosophical level, what this throws up is some important questions. And at a philosophical level, it throws up this question about a new way of being. A new way of being, which I think in a complex system, every agent has to recognize that they have partiality of knowing. None of us can know everything. So if the reality is that we only exist in partial knowing, then we have to recognize that we always have to exist in doubt. And I think this is where Descartes might have said something useful. If you were to read the whole of his premise, I would extrapolate it to mean I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. And that would suggest that the I am only exists on the basis of doubt. And I would argue in a complex system, the recognition of I doubt, because we recognize our partiality of knowing, is systematically important in order to be able to operate with a theory of tentativeness, tenderness, and care. Because if you recognize you don't have all-knowing capacity and universal knowledge, but you only have partiality in knowing, your behavior has to be rooted through tentativeness, tenderness, and care. And why I would argue that in a complex system, moving to a posture rooted in that, not just for humans, but also for machines and also for other forms of thinking, which are rooted in this theory of doubt rather than certainty and the illusion of certainty, into a theory of doubt, tentativeness, and tenderness and care, is a different way of being, where governance becomes an emergent function of tentativeness and tenderness as a way of operating. So this opens up a bigger question for me about, as the age becomes more volatile, as it becomes more degenerative, how do we open up a framework of new ways of being that allow us to operate in the complexity that we need to? And how do we jump from an age of violence that we're about to enter into this behavior? And I think that is an open question as we start to move it. It's also what this is, for me, throwing up is a recognition that this is no longer a moral thesis. I'm not saying be tender and kind because of a moral question. I'm saying in a complex world, it's the most efficient means of organizing and learning is a different way of organizing. And that moves us from theories rooted around control models of organizing to learning models of organizing as a means of coherence becoming an emergent function rather than a control function. So I'm laying out a bit of a sort of, what I'm kind of interested in is all of us maybe getting into a conversation around this as well. But what I'm seeking to lay out is a trajectory where I think there's a new way of being and behaving that is vital to operating in complexity. I'm also laying out that's probably the only way to unlock complex value in the way we're doing. I'm also laying out that's the way that actually human-machine systems can start to unlock, and ecological systems can unlock a new way of organizing that's operating into complexity as opposed to trying to operate in for simplicity and externalization and extractionism. And I think what we are entering an age of is that is now possible. It is now possible. The question is, how do we move a trajectory that we're in where volatility is going to force us into types of control doctrines that I think are actually self-terminating? So how we make this convenient leap from volatility to being able to absorb that volatility through anti-fragile behaviors and new anti-fragile means of organizing that are rooted in new behaviors, and building through a theory of security, which is rooted not in defensibility purely, but in a systems view of security, becomes the political operating narrative and a new capability narrative that I think is central. And I think that opens up a different theory of governance and operating, which is fundamentally different and also allows us to be able to operate in the complexity that we're organizing into. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm sorry if that was a lot of words, and I'm sorry if it was a lot of sequence of logics, but I just wanted to, you guys are all brilliant, so I'm sure this wasn't in any way, new or special, but I feel like that's become one of the central questions that we're facing over the next 5 to 10 years, is how we make this transition. And this transition is rooted in our very sense of what it means to be. or become, or into become. And it's rooted in not only ourselves, but in theories of how we make agentic systems or agent-based systems, all the way through to how we perceive life and other forms of ecosystems around us, and also how we organize, and thereby how we organize into volatility. So with that, I'm going to stop and open up to questions. I hope that was partially interesting.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Indy. And I want to see if you had any kind of opening for the Q&A, or if you just wanted to start diving in and taking questions, because we have a stack open up.
Yes, I think we can just start with questions and sort of dive into some of these points that Indy has made very quickly, explore the depths of those points and where we should go. So, Val, will you do the call on people stack?
Yeah, Christina, you were first to type stack in chat. Thanks for that. So take it away.
I would actually love to go after Adam.
Cool. Adam, you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I wanted to echo back a little bit of what I heard, just to see if I'm capturing it correctly. And obviously you said a lot more than this, so this is just a snippet of what I heard. But it seems to me that I was hearing that our capability, I don't know if we ever had great capability of predicting and planning, but we seem to like to do that. But it seems that our ability to predict and plan as it pertains to governance is going to get harder and practically impossible, to the point that we need to transition when we're thinking about governance from attempting to plan and control and predict, and as agents, that our role might become more of sensing and responding and sharing what we're sensing, and that in kind of like a more of an agentic conglomeration would be how governance would emerge, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But I wanted to see if I was capturing something that you were saying, or if I was hallucinating, or so. But that was the topic that came out to me.
Yeah, no, very much, Adam. And I just want to sort of maybe, this is why I think the acceptance of doubt and partiality of knowing is really important, right? Because if you can recognize that it's informationally impossible for anything to know everything, and you have to operate in recognition of doubt, then thereby the conclusion becomes that you have to operate in a theory of tentativeness and tenderness as a haptic response to the world, and in care, because you have to recognize partiality of knowing. So the logical leap in those, and the reason why I use those particular words in those sequence is because they operate between a self-recognition cycle, but also a haptic cycle of how you operate in the world itself. So there's a whole stack of operating into that reality. So, and I think that is a different way of being. That's a different way of manifesting into the world than what we've been taught to manifest like. And I also think that's a different way of coding institutions or machines into the world and helping them be than what we've historically manifested like, which is through the illusion of certainty, through the illusion of universal knowledge, certainty, action, instruction. So there's a completely different stack of operating to what this stack requires. And just to sort of, the reason why I'm putting those stacks in comparison to each other is because I think the stack of tenderness is not a moral question for me anymore. What I'm saying is the illusion of control, the illusion of universal knowledge sets out externalities and extractionism, which become self-terminating. This is just this is a civilizational transformation to operate in entanglement. And I think the other thing that I would say is that the culture wars that I perceive us in is a culture war of a world and a planet that is forcibly re-entangling us. I think we're forcibly being re-entangled. Climate breakdown is a forcible re-entanglement to the delusions of separation that we were operating in. And I think the culture wars is between that operating in entanglement to trying to operate in an industrial 19th century idea of freedom, which is rooted in separationalism and free agency, in extra dependent of anyone else, or beyond the dependency of anyone else. And I think that's the culture wars that we're in the middle of. And I think that's partly because, not to be political, but constitutions like the US are rooted in an idea of an industrial freedom. And not just, and then many of us have culturally adopted those constitutions. So it's not even the constitution, it's the cultural adoption of that has become the operating framework to which we're operating into. So we've seen a profusion of an industrial idea of freedom rooted in separationalism, individualism, discreteness, object-subject relationships, a dominion theory as a result of it, and violence through different means. And I think that's why I would put those things. So I don't know, Adam, I'm just rarefying the conversation, I suppose. You understood it perfectly. I just wanted to put nuance onto why I was choosing particular words and particular things.
Awesome. Christina, you're up next.
So I want to just frame a few things from my perspective as a knowledge ecologist. I do system and network mapping for communities. And when I do the strategy mapping process, the boundary of a map is a question. The way maps overlap are with questions. Joe Edelman's work on question trees to hold questions open seems very relevant. So how do we partner with people who have the same deep, long questions is a way to ground work in uncertainty. And the things that show up on every single map, it doesn't matter if it's food security, healthcare coordination, climate mitigation and adaptation. There are two nodes that are like stuck in every system. And one is usually called the same thing, and one is called all sorts of different things. The first one is called misaligned financial incentives, and people almost always say that same phrase for that stuck thing in the system. The best efforts that I see are those that include how do we actually look at the financial system with an idea of what is enough. So the myco-punk, myco-fi approach to looking at resource flows from mycelial networks is really promising. There's people working on math around like putting the idea of enough into the system so that you then have overflow and no one plant in the garden is getting all the water. You just have, soil with proper hydrological principles. The second one that people call all sorts of different things, like ability to lead, teaming capacity, ability to care for others, etc. It's fundamentally like adult developmental capacity, and it rests on both critical thinking and emotional coherence, and like what you're saying, tenderness and care. So thank you for giving me a way to articulate this stuff, and I think that question stacking, like the more, if any facilitators are listening to this, the more we can bring questions into spaces, like in groups, when we confront this sense of solidity and individualism and like the noun-like world, like I think a lot of the work is moving nouns to verbs right now, and people get scared. Like uncertainty is really horrible. Like imagine you don't know if you're going to get that job and you're like sitting on tenterhooks. People don't like it, and that's very, very human. And so as we facilitate groups, as we're like bringing people together, how do you blow up the group's capability bubble, or the capable of the group, to sit with uncertainty together without like popping and collapsing back into fear? I think that is like a capability in the system that I think is a limiting factor, because there's just not enough people that are like, sit with uncertainty with us. So I guess that's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, No, thank you. And I think there's loads of different. Firstly, I think one of the big underlying questions that I think I'm constantly holding is that, you know, when I get into the space, people say, "Oh, we need more cooperatives," right? And I'm sitting there going, "But the Mondragon cooperative, right, is equally as extractive as McKinsey when it operates in India." Because the Mondragon cooperative, there's nothing wrong with the Mondragon. It's a great group, right? Brilliant. But once you create a boundary, you also create the other. And so if you're going to, and I think the big 21st century problem here is how we go from bounded models of organizing, corporations, cooperatives, these are all bounded theories, to non-bounded means of organizing. And I think this is the 21st century problem. And also, this also challenges all of our work by Ellen Elstrom, who is untouchable usually, but most of her work is rooted in bounded commons theory. So the problem is that actually her work is rooted in bounded commons, and most of our problem spaces are actually focused on unbounded commons problems. And so unless we can find a means to organize and address unbounded commons problems and non-bounded organizing, I don't think we can operate in an entangled world, because we'll always create a meta-other. And as soon as you create a meta-other, you create the propensity for violence into that, that's rooted into that. And I just want to name it because I think it's just one of those silent things that I think is worth just really name. And I'm not saying I know how to solve this. I'm not saying any of that stuff. I'm just saying that I think feels closer to the problem domain than what we end up talking about. Second thing I think, which I think you alluded to, is that we are playing in the illusion of an infinite game whilst actually operating a finite game. So we are operating a finite game, which is self-terminating us, but we're creating the illusion of this is an infinite game. And I think once you collapse that illusion, something interesting happens. So the total value at risk in London is 3.8 million homes. 3.8 million homes on an average price of 668,000 per house is 2.52 trillion. Not billion, trillion, right? Just London. Now, why that's important is if you are looking at the total value at risk in this game, it is not growth of London, it is the 2.52 trillion available on the game. So when you start to put the finite game theory and the costs of the finite game theory into that's currently being played and start to price models out in that finite game theory, you start to realize capital has different interests than what it's being manipulated towards. So I think there's a really important collapse that's required between the illusion of the infinite game and actually the game that we're playing, and starting to construct economics which recognize those things and start to say, well, there's 2.52 trillion on the table as a result of actually losing the state's ice shelf. Now talk to me about how much we're willing to price the total value at risk and what it means to actually manage that risk in real formats. So I'm just using that as an example, which I think is really, really, really critical. And then the final point that I think, just building on what was said, I think there's something really, you know, we're living in a cultural concept of, so the reality of how I imagine us as humans is we've been coded to see ourselves as individuated things. You know, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, you know, put us in the middle of a platonic circle in the square, idealized us, separated us from the world. But we know for reality that we are codependent with microbiomes. We know that we are a multitude. We know that our brain is a social brain. We perhaps even know that quantum tunneling in our brain is actually operating at a conscious level that we're not really self-aware of yet. Even if you were to take that starts to break the individuation of being human to being a phenomena of being interbecomings. We are interbecomings. We are relationally, non-divisibly related to the planet. And why that's important is, you know, the blue marble sort of picture everyone glorifies, the overview effect. What people often say is, oh my God, it was just blew my mind. I so thought how precious the earth is. Right? This is the usual narrative. I want to give you a different layer on that narrative, which is, imagine this is the planet being able to perceive itself for the first time. The planet became self-aware enough to perceive itself. And if you look at it through that lens, what you see is the planet is becoming self-aware. And we are part of the planet as a micro, with our machines, with all of that, that is just part of the planet becoming systemically self-aware at every level. And I think what was interesting about the overview effect of it is it's still, everyone still talks about the humans and the profound love for the planet as a distant subjected organism. But if you frame it that we are just a planet becoming self-aware, it's a fundamentally different type of realization and relationship to that planet. I think there's something really interesting for me about how a lot of this question is not about the boundary, but is in our capacity to operate in relationality. And our building our capabilities to operate and being in relationality is quite a different behavioral response. And this goes back to the original question from Adam. I think it's rooted in a different way of being and relating in the world as well. So anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Gurdon, I want to give you the opportunity to voice your question that you shared in chat.
I feel like maybe Rosalind has a direct comment on what's being talked about. Maybe you can go. I'm most happy to go for it, Rosalind.
That's also Adam in chat, so I want to
Thanks.
just jump in.
Adam DL posted a question about decentralized technologies. I'm curious, Adam, if you want to come off mute and give voice to your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Am I audible? Yeah. I didn't want to get too specific. The question is perhaps a bit narrow for what I was actually driving at, but I think you opened the conversation around technologies and uncoupling from states in that sense. And I think there's the technology question. I think inevitably is going to be a bit part of this. You just alluded to the view of the blue dot, which involves technology, and we had to get to the moon somehow. So I think the technology question is there. But what sort of concerns me a bit is that even with the sort of open source movement and the sort of non-proprietary technologies, they actually end up, it seems, getting kind of reinscribed into a sort of essentially a capitalist model. That's why I wanted to sort of reference something. I wasn't really trying to be specific, but like something like stablecoins is very much a kind of monetary system that we exist in today, and that's coming into the technology. So I think that the sort of the question I was alluding to was sort of how do we bring governance that is not tied to the stateful model, the state model that perhaps we're trying to uncouple from, so it's not bounded in that sense. How do we bring that governance into technology? This technology question was the direction of my question. trying not to be overly specific about which technology.
No, I appreciate that, and I think I think this is a really there's multiple horizons to this question, I suppose, is the first thing. So if you were, if we were collectively managing 100 billion fund or 100 million fund, I'd be saying, great, let's talk to states, critical states, where we can move public registries, state registries, and move into the civic economy, because that's going to allow for them to not be weaponized later. So I'd be making some real tactical moves on that sort of landscape. And what would be our means of doing that? Could we actually do civic buyouts? What would be our means of organizing that and being able to construct economies for that? And that's really first horizon plays. And I think we need to move very quickly on that. The second horizon plays, which I think become more important, is that I think transnational locations like glacier systems and other forms of transnational locations, I think are going to be interesting sites for new forms of technological governance to come into play. And I'm going to cite, for example, the River Danube was actually where international waters, the idea of international waters, was born first. And it was born there because effectively after a conflict and war between I think it was 10 to 12 states, they realized the only way they were going to deal with common goods was in the construction of international waters. And that set up the principle for the UN and other things to be born. So why I'm rooting there is I think if we can talk about critical transnational goods like glacier systems and water hydrological systems, I think the governance of those things is going to be where we're going to create new forms of technologies that are going to have to be outside the preview of state in the traditional framework and also open up a new pathway. So if you then say, what's my second horizon of allocation? It's my second horizon allocation is on these transnational goods, because I think that's where we're going to be able to have the political space to operate. And then the third horizon of allocation, which I think is much more philosophical for me, is my worry has been the decentralized movement of technology has largely been what I would say has been rooted in fractionalization and also just playing decentralized central bank games. Specifically talking about two dimensions of it. What we haven't seen is new classes of relational technologies. So we've used the technology of decentralization and crypto largely to create new fractional plays and verifiable trustless plays, or whatever you want to call them. And I don't believe in any of those words, rather than creating new forms of relational plays. And I'm going to give you a really practical example of what I mean by that. Computational contracting and relationship allows us to come to, so I'm going to use the Highline. We did this work a long time ago where we basically said the Highline cost 178 million to build. If you had smart covenants on all the adjacent land, and you had those covenants were basically saying 10% of the increase in value would be shared back to be able to fund the Highline in the future, you could have effectively paid for the whole Highline in 10 months. But what it would have required is a relationship between the capital allocation and probably 10,000 micro real estate owners. And to be able to construct that arrangement that relational arrangement between many investors and many contributors of value, I think computational technologies give us a pathway to construct these many-to-many arrangements in a way that analog technologies have never been able to do because the costs of transactions are too high. And I think in the construction of that agreement space, a new economic form emerges that isn't smart contracts, that operates in a different theory of value, not only first order value, but second order value, because you can do all sorts of different ways of sharing value dynamically, streaming value dynamically across these many-to-many systems. And why I think that's important, this is a really poor first horizon example, but there are other examples that we worked into. I think that's a relational contribution play. And you can also, we've been doing work around commitment engines. So how do you hold commitments? How do you hold commitments which are then bonded? I think we can start to construct these structured many-to-many agreement economies, and what we call them is structured economic systems. So they are not complete financial transactions, they're multi-actor economic arrangements with multi-contribution systems. And I think that is a class of economic organizing that I think can be radically interesting, rather than the fractionalization of assets that has been populated about into those frameworks. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's a whole spectrum conversation of technology to be had. I also think the final point I wanted to add was that I think if you're a really smart capital allocator, you recognize the first generation of VC basically allocates to relationships. People they know, people they get to introduce to, it's relationship based. Second generation of allocators do what I would call portfolio theory. They focus on high domain values, and then they have a portfolio investment in high domains of value, recognizing that it's basically a spread bet where one will get a unicorn. But there's a third horizon of risk capital allocation, which is not rooted on any of those theories, but is rooted on allocating for learning. So what you're doing is then allocating to 100 founders to allow them to learn and search a discovery space. And what you're recognizing is not that you're optimizing for a win. What you're optimizing for is the search capacity of these founders to be able to work into a terrain. And then what you're doing is second round capital allocation on the optimization of discovery rather than actually optimizing for win spaces. So learning in that model becomes actually the predominant theory of organizing. I don't think I've seen any venture capital fund operate through systemic learning as a means of organizing at speed and scale. A16Z, when it first started off, was thinking like this, but then it became a consolidated structure and a very classical mechanism. And I think, so I'm not even saying, and so why I'm saying all this, I think there's horizons of capital that we're going to have to run through. And there's a pathway of how we transform capital's current optimization from control to learning to a future capital model, which is able to securitize future value, bring it back to present day mechanism. Then there's an intermediary model, which takes resources and creates resource-backed currencies to create liquidity, as we saw with bills of exchange and other frameworks to do that. So I think we're going to have to take a real structured view on this transition. Certainly, I think that's how we are thinking about it in this way, through these layers of allocations and models. I don't know if that helps. I try to, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's a very liberating explanation. It unlocks a lot of areas for further thought. Thank you, because I think the space is getting stifling in ways you described.
Yes, thank you for that, Indy. And we have time for one more question. So Rosalind, please.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief because I know we're coming up on time. You mentioned cooperatives as a attractive force still, and I don't disagree. I walk around co-ops and commons, and because they all closed, they do have that issue. And so I've walked on the edge of thinking about like what multi-stakeholder forums look like and how you can keep opening that bubble. And I think that's a place to operate. And I know folks here do some of this, like Christina, with like looking at these larger social communication systems. How do we open those networks? And I've walked and looked at or researched around like digital governance, liquid democracy, etc. And I think there's options there, but they still get jammed up in a lot of ways, whether it's the interface or the financial incentives that come into them, etc. I think as you were talking about with crypto there for a minute as well. And I guess the question I'm sitting with, maybe this is extremely biased because I'm currently in the job hunt and I'm trying to figure out like where I want to find myself. And I think maybe this is something for a bunch of us, is like, what's the effective action points, the leverage points? And you talked about this in your Horizon some, but on these huge systemic levels. And I'm like, well, as governance designers, as people thinking and moving in this space, what are the pieces that we need to be able to open up those silos and to be able to operate in parallel or as an alternative force to capital and the state as it stands, because we are effectively walking against those institutions. Hopefully that's clear. I'll leave it there.
No, it's great. I mean, I can just tell you where we're moving and intuitively what we're seeing. So the domains that I think governance futures are going to be like hydrological cycles and glaciers. I'm saying that for a reason, because they pose an existential threat of the loss of glaciers means that loss of hydrological cycles, loss of predictable water systems, which means the loss of food systems in terms of how we're seeing them. So these transnational goods, and I'm just using that as one, I think transnational goods are going to be where the future of planetary governance is going to be figured out. It's not going to be figured out in the UN. It's not going to be figured out anywhere. It's going to be figured out in these transnational goods. I really think that. So, and I think also capital and strategic risk capital is starting to recognize that problem. So the first thing I would say is, I think many of us should be operating there. Two, I think there's going to be a whole design of security economics. So, we've done a lot of work on this now, and I think, what does security economics mean for foundational goods of energy, water, cognitive security? I think this is going to be where capital will flow, and traditional theories of security, which are rooted in
Indy, we lost your voice.
Earbuds out of batteries every time.
Indy, we can't hear you.
Oh, Indy. Oh, I think he can't hear us also. I think the AirPods are. I'll send him
Oh,
a message.
sorry.
Yeah, you're back. I think your
Is
AirPods
that
are battery.
is that all right? Or can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back. You're back.
Yeah. So I was saying security economics was the key thing for me, which is effectively recognizing that we're going to see the value of continuity of supply of energy, food, water, critical things. I think they're going to have to be constructed as hybrid economics between collective good and distributed good frameworks. I think there's a whole economic design and an economic incentive system that's going to be capitalized. I think designing that security in the face where the cost of disruption is near zero and the impact of disruption is virtually infinite. That changes the theory of what security looks like fundamentally in the 21st century. And I think that's a real eye of a needle for a new political theory off the back of that. So I think that's a key space. I think then the other thing that I think is going to be also geography. So if I was working on currencies, I'd almost certainly be working on resource-backed currencies in low liquidity environments like in Africa, where actually what we're seeing is liquidity throttling happening by Western economies. I think we're going to see radical new currency innovation happening in the African continent to create new forms of liquidity in the monetary theory. I think we're going to see some really interesting stuff happening over the next 5 to 10 years on, even the next 5 years. So that's where I'd be moving across. And then the fundamental thing is resilience and resilience or adaptation economies are going to open up economies. Like I said, if you put 2.52 trillion at risk in London, I think that's going to construct a whole new theory of multi-party agreements, multi-party organizing, pooling of risk at value. That's going to actually change the dynamics of this stuff. And because these are existential threats, they're very difficult to manage through coercion. So they're very, very difficult to manage through coercion because of the nature of what they operate into. So they require a new quality of governance into those tables. So those are probably the domains that I would intuitively play into, and that's a lot of stuff that we're playing back into as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Indy. Thank you everyone for being here. And
Yes. I look forward to keeping engaged in these topics, and we'll share the recording. There's ways to follow up in the Slack channels as well.
yes, you can join the Metagov Slack and we can have a follow-up discussion in the Metagov seminar channel underneath this talk. But thank you everyone. If you don't mind unmuting or sending some claps for Indy, our speakers and our facilitators, and Gurdon, thank you all so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Clap, 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 clap.
Woohoo!
And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Gratitude to all.